Welcome everybody to our next session. We have some fabulous presenters this time around on very different topics. So to start with, we have Amit Kaushik. I hope I have said that correctly. Conservation PhD student from the University of Georgia here in the US. And while his PhD is going to examine human tiger and human wolf relationships, the work he will discuss today centers around antelope and cattle in India. Wanted to give you a note that this presentation does contain images of deceased other than human animal bodies in various states. So little trigger warning. So Amit, I turn it over to you.
So I'm going to present a critical analysis of this large-bodied mammal species called Nilgai in context of the political currents in India, specifically focusing on the rural-urban gradients. So I would appreciate any sort of feedback or questions which can help me improve this work. So let's start with a brief context of the representation of Nilgai in India. In the summer of 2016, the government of Bihar, a state in eastern India, ordered the shooting of 250 Nilgais for raiding farmers' crops, justifying culling as a measure of its population control. This photo taken from a primetime news report is titled, "Government Hunts the Nilgai, More than 250 Nilgais Killed in Bihar." This led to a public debate, with animals rights activists stating that this was a trigger-happy approach in lieu of a scientific policy on wildlife management, and advocates of culling stating that it was necessary to take this drastic measure as overabundance of the animal threatens farmers' livelihood. Nilgai, or Bosselophagus tragocamelus, is Asia's largest antelope. It is a generalist species which occurs in semi-arid landscapes, and its diet comprises of grasses, herbs, shrubs, and fruits. It shares the habitat with other ungulates like spotted deer, sambar deer, and blackbuck, and forms smaller herd groups. These small herd groups form clusters in a suitable environment and have an impact over its ecology. The Nilgai's wide ecological niche thus predisposes it to be attracted to open agricultural areas which serve as a source of rich, nutritious food and to raid crops. This situates Nilgai as ecological dislocates, moving closer to anthropocentric realities. In India, protected areas such as national parks and wildlife sanctuaries have been imagined as spaces for large-bodied mammals under the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. But animals transgress boundaries, often finding themselves in farmlands or near human settlements, a threat to both life and property. Elephants in eastern and southern India, leopards in villages and cities, tigers in settlements near protected areas, and rhesus macaques in all geographies have found themselves at the center of what we call human-wildlife conflict, exacerbated by habitat loss and fragmentation. In this light, the Nilgai offers an interesting example. It is seen as neither particularly threatening nor charismatic. It can cause massive crop damages, yet find limited mention in global conversations about human-wildlife conflicts, compared to predators or other crop-raiding mammals like the elephants in India. I therefore became interested in how Nilgai was represented in conservation debates in India around culling, asking the following questions. What interspecies associations or disassociations enable us to be culled or protected? And what representations attempt to spatially locate it? To study this, I first traced the different etymologies of the animal, which reveal the story of its scientific classification. Second, through my examination of the culling debate, I analyzed what ecologies, traits, and behaviors of the Nilgai are enrolled in representations by different actors. I also comment on continuities with colonial hunting practices and how it shaped conservation approaches. I find the Nilgai's association with the cow held sacred by Hindus in India, bringing together unlikely different actors in the culling debate. What it might first look as a debate between conservation and livelihood is complicated by the notions of holiness. Nomenclature records show how Nilgai, an antelope was first named as Antilope picta in 1966. Later, in 1939, it was classified under the genus Bosselophagus. Its lineage classification, Bosselophagus tragocamelus, comprising bos, which means a cow, elophus, which means a deer, tragus, which means a goat, and camelus, which means a camel. Even though its classification is composed of other animals, it is the only species under its genus. Local variations of the name also point to etymologically arrived interspecies associations. During the reign of Mughal king Aurangzeb, the animal was called Nilgai, meaning blue horse. In northern India, it is also known as rose or rojada, which means an antelope or precisely a forest antelope. In mainstream discussions, this hybridity is translated into a singular association with cow using the word Nilgai. A forest guard I interviewed in Delhi even called the animal Jungle ki Gai, translating to a forest cow. Let's take apart the word Nilgai. In Hindi, the word Nil means blue and the word Gai means cow. Literally, the English translation should be blue cow. But the translations always use blue bull. Only in Hindi does the association of the animal with the cow emerge. As Ronald Barthes puts it, explicit cultural representations can be modified through concepts, knowledges, and acts, which shapes our representations of nature. However, the suffix "gai" need not translate into holy connotations universally. In Texas, for example, where the animal was introduced as game species in 1937, its commonly used name remains Nilgai, allowing it to be culled as a game species. In India too, I find mentions of Nilgai being killed for meat in a few legal cases. Hence, merely attaching the suffix does not necessarily imply the animal's holiness. Actors must be present to attach meanings to the connotations, which, as we see in the next section, gets intensified in particular political movements. The act of killing an animal is historically rooted in who could access close encounters with nature. For colonial and post-colonial India, elite hunters such as Jim Corbett and Salim Ali found themselves transformed into saviors of both animals and the local people. By protecting carnivores and birds, their former objects of hunt, they set up hierarchy in which herbivores became important only as a prey species. After the ban on hunting of most wildlife in India under the Wildlife Protection Act, professional hunters were and are invited to cull vermin animals. For example, in case of Bihar, professional hunters were invited from outside to cull Nilgai. Hunting overtones were also evident in another controversial strategy. The state government of the state of Rajasthan in India proposed to invite the state's youth to shoot non-lethal vaccine darts at the animal. Strategies to control populations of problem animals depends on where the animal is thought to be in overabundance, or if it does not follow its normal feeding pattern. Its habitat and feeding behavior became encoded into linguistic concepts of purity and pollution, a process of othering not dissimilar when humans are placed in a hierarchy. The word vermin is then symbolic of transgression, how certain animals which cross the human-defined boundaries are blamed for breaking imaginations of the spatial world. Under the Wildlife Protection Act, large-scale culling can only occur if the union government declares an animal as the vermin. Which animal can be classified as vermin depends on its rank within the Act, divided into 5 schedules of decreasing protection levels. Only animals included in Schedule 3rd or to Schedule 5 can be culled. The Nilgai is under Schedule 3, wild enough to be protected, but nuisance enough to be allowed periodic culling. But when Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP, which bases its politics in Hindutva, permitted to cull Nilgai in Bihar in 2015, it was a historic decision. Never before had a union government declared an animal as vermin to allow large-scale culling. Nilgai's association with the cow becomes important here, as under the BJP government, the cow has become deeply embedded in communal contestations. Cow vigilante groups have formed in states of northern India implicated in violence over eating of beef, or even on suspicions of cattle trading. The decision to cull Nilgai thus set in tensions with the cow vigilante groups who protested vehemently against culling, terminating it sacrilegious. Observers note that this is complicit with the new reordering of nature, where talking about any animal must dovetail with talking about the cow, called saffronization of ecology. Saffron is the primary color associated with the Hindutva movement in India. Ministers within the BJP government also protested the move, but represented the animal differently. Maneka Gandhi, Union Minister and wildlife activist, decried it as lust for killing, representing the animal as innocent, helpless, and suffering pain. Other wildlife activists based their protests in deep ecology and even Indian ethics of non-violence. The Nilgai therefore brought together two unlikely comrades: cow vigilante groups who bases their politics in saffronization of ecology and practice violence, and certain wildlife activists who ground their protests under deep ecology and practice non-violence. Wildlife experts do not oppose culling in principle, but mobilize scientific representations. According to them, culling of problem animal, if at all, must be based on long-term population-specific studies of the Nilgai's behavior and ecology, which only exists for the animal in Texas since the 1960s. They decry that in India, newspaper reports random estimates suggesting a scientific wildlife management policy based on comprehensive population and behavioral studies. Experts have also suggested other methods for dealing with suspected Nilgai overabundance. A popular strategy is translocation. Often the Nilgai has been translocated to protected areas if found transgressing, using the Boma technique imported from Africa. Horse riders or chasers funnel Nilgai herds into closures and then sedate them. Technologies to repel Nilgai also involves using light-emitting or reflective objects or playing audio tapes in farmlands for scaring away the animals. But these technologies of displacement have certain limitations. For example, translocation is not only expensive, but time-consuming. Experts say that it will create vacuums where other Nilgais can move in, only solving the problem temporarily. This causes both scientists and villagers to lament the lack of predators. In a village in Madhya Pradesh, farmers have demanded introduction of predators who could control Nilgai population in farmlands. This reinforces the representations of the large wild herbivore as only a prey base for cosmopolitan large carnivores like the tigers or lions. Clearly, Nilgai's habitat, grasslands, farmlands, scrublands are marginal to conservation strategies, as its in grassland management or seed dispersal is hardly represented in either popular or scientific discourses. For example, Nilgai's ficus can facilitate seed dispersal of acacia tree in dry scrublands. But Nilgai is resurgent in novel urban ecologies. For example, in Delhi, Nilgai are often encountered while strolling in city parks, eating at garbage dumps, and crossing roads. But sometimes concerned citizens call rescue operators to transport Nilgai back to city forest. The reality that I encountered at the Sanjeevan forest in South Delhi was starkly different. Delhi Development Authority, which manages the forest, provides timely stall feed for Nilgai. Entire human organizations are therefore enrolled in efforts to make Nilgai wild. In this investigation, I traced how Nilgai is sometimes denoted vermin, a problem, an encroacher, a holy animal, a wild herbivore, mapping animals' geographies onto human geographies. But as I have also seen, the Nilgai resists passive representations. Cow vigilantes and wildlife activists unify to protest culling. Scientists and entire state departments also forced to rethink conservation strategies in both rural and urban areas, and human-animal spaces becomes blurred. Therefore, the animal does not sit easily between any of these representations, transgresses the moral and spatial hierarchies conferred to it, and brings together both humans and other non-humans actors in unexpected assemblages. With this, I would like to acknowledge following people, key respondents, my friend Prerna, based at University of California, another friend Ajay, based at Ambedkar University, and Center for Urban Ecology and Sustainability at Ambedkar University. And thank you all.
Thank you, Amit. We're going to have just I had one question I'm going to have you clarify, I think, now, and then we'll save our questions, I think, and do them all together at the end. But could you just explain the saffronization? That's not a term that we use a lot in the US. And I think a lot of people are curious about what that means.
Do you mean saffronization?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so basically it's a color like saffron color, like which is being used by the right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the political party of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and they have been using like this saffron color, like in politicizing different humans and non-human actors. So for example, like beef eating has been saffronized. This is what like I'm using saffronization because they have been like there are different vigilante groups which attack people who carry any beef or like any like beef related like products also.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. All right, so then just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, I think we're going to move on to Dominique's presentation, and then we will have all of our questions and answers. At the end, we'll ask individual questions and answers. Our next speaker is Dominique Augustin, who graduated from Canisius College here in the US with her MS in 2022. She works now with Zoo Miami in Miami, Florida, and Dominique is beginning her PhD studies at the University of Exeter in the UK this month. So welcome.
Hi, thank you for joining me today. I'm Dominique Augustin. Today we're talking about considering the individual at the zoo, treating otters differently. And my co-researchers are Alexis Hart and Molly McGuire. Some background to get us started. Animal welfare is a field concerned with non-human animals, which I will be referring to simply as animals in this presentation. Animal welfare is defined by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Animal Welfare Committee as an animal's physical, mental, and emotional state over a period of time, and is measured on a continuum of poor to good. Animal welfare is a field of research in which we try to assess the welfare state of a non-human animal, but it's also importantly an issue with a large ethical dimension about how we ought to treat other animals. It's a field born out of public ethical concern. I want to briefly mention the difference between animal rights and animal welfare. Animal rights is a philosophy that argues non-human animals have moral rights as subjects of a life and therefore should not be used in any way. In animal welfare, animals are often also viewed as subjects of a life, but the conclusions on their ethical use differs. In my personal ethical lens, some use of animals can be morally permissible when the aggregate benefit outweighs any suffering and the animals experience good welfare. In my life, that means I don't eat animals or animal byproducts, but I do work in a zoo, specifically with the intention of improving animal welfare so that zoos can fulfill their obligations to animals and exist ethically while pursuing their conservation and education missions. I'm employed at an AZA zoo, Zoo Miami, where I conduct welfare research that contributes to the management of our animals. We utilize many forms of welfare assessments, but primarily my research focuses on behavioral assessments and the evaluation of how certain variables affect individual behavior and habitat use. Now, today we're going to be talking about Cyrene's stereotypy. Now, a stereotypy is defined as a repetitive, invariant behavior pattern with no obvious goal or function. They're abnormal because they appear to be restricted only to captive animals, and they're often associated with a past or present suboptimal aspect of the environment. So the presence of a stereotypy is often a welfare indicator. It's important to note, though, that a stereotypy is not always an accurate indicator of poor welfare. Stereotypies may develop as a surrogate for a natural behavior. They may serve as a coping mechanism to increase or decrease arousal, and they might also become habits where they occur regardless of stimulus, and then they just become automatic. So while it's a good idea to look into stereotypies in case they might signal room for welfare improvement, a failure to reduce a stereotypy is not necessarily a failure to improve welfare. At Zoo Miami, we have 2 Asian small-clawed otters. They're 16 years old. They're litter mates, Cyrene and Awe, and they have been socially housed, experience the same environment, husbandry and management, but only Cyrene engages in a stereotypic paw-sucking behavior in which she sucks on her front paw, as you might be able to tell in that blurry little picture there. Once we learn about Cyrene's stereotypy, the well-being team began to monitor the behavior to determine how much of her day she's spending engaged in that stereotypic paw-sucking. We developed an ethogram based on her species-typical and Cyrene-typical behavior, and we utilize a software called Zoo Monitor to record the behavior, habitat use, and crowd level data every minute over 20-minute sessions, with sessions spread out over various times of the day. After collecting several months of baseline data, analysis showed paw-sucking steadily increased each month and suggested a positive correlation between paw-sucking and crowd levels. Based on these results, I hypothesized that paw-sucking may be a coping mechanism to decrease arousal and suspected that an additional opportunity for privacy might allow her an alternative tool for coping. To increase Cyrene's ability to choose privacy, I designed and installed an additional hiding structure and placed it in the habitat. The new hide has been on habitat for about a month, and so far it appears paw-sucking has continued to increase, but paw-sucking while utilizing the hide is rare. Cyrene spends about 24% of the time she's observed using the hide, but only about 5% of her paw-sucking seems to take place there. It's really difficult to draw conclusions from this data, as there are many possible variables that we may not even know about. Our next steps are to remove the hide and see if paw-sucking returns to baseline, which would suggest something about the addition of the hide actually increased paw-sucking, so maybe she's neophobic. Anecdotally, staff have reported Cyrene engages in paw-sucking after training sessions, so we'll be comparing training dates to behavioral data to assess if there's a possible correlation there. It's also possible the paw-sucking is a way to increase arousal in the absence of sufficiently engaging enrichment, and we can test if the addition of more complex enrichment or increased training sessions correlate with a decrease in paw-sucking. A lot of the focus in animal welfare right now is on assessments. When animal welfare field was developing with animal agriculture in mind, there was a focus on group welfare over individual welfare. Partly this is because farms had so many individuals and it's difficult to identify and regularly monitor individuals, so outputs like reproductive capacity and mass illness were monitored. In zoos, animal caretakers are working with much smaller populations, so individuals are able to be monitored on an individual basis, and a lot of the time that is through their behavior and getting to know them as individuals. When addressing welfare, we're often encouraged to consider natural histories of the species and personal histories of the individual, but in this case, both Cyrene and Awe share personal histories since they're both from the same litter and were both hand-reared by the same people in the same place. So these otters did have to be pooled for hand-rearing because their mother ate the several litters prior to them. And there is evidence to suggest that early separation from the mother is linked to the development of abnormal behaviors, but interestingly, this appears to only be the case for Cyrene. So to understand if there's any personality precursors that led to Cyrene developing a stereotypy while Awe did not, I tracked down their adoptive human mom, the keeper who hand-reared them 16 years ago. So keeper mom said that the otters would go back and forth from her home to the zoo and to the homes of 2 other staff who helped hand raise them. She said back then there was no concern over Cyrene's paw sucking and nobody saw it as causing any problems. The keeper explained that it was expected for hand-reared animals to have trouble behaving like real animals. I found her word choice here very interesting. What makes an animal a real animal? Is it their natural behaviors? We try very hard not to pull animals for hand rearing because it can become a vicious cycle. Hand-reared animals may have trouble rearing their own young because they were not taught rearing behaviors. So perhaps that's part of what she meant. Even so, If hand rearing reduces the otterness of the otter and maternal deprivation can cause stereotypy, it is still interesting that Cyrene and Awe responded to the same situation differently. Their keeper mom explained to me that Awe wanted to be an otter and Cyrene wanted to be a baby. To give us some foundation to discuss personality, I looked into the 5-factor model for personality that is used in humans. So it looks at neuroticism, agreeableness, extroversion, openness, and conscientiousness. When Gosling and John investigated personality research in other than human animals using this framework, they proposed adding a dominance dimension. So jumping off from their work, I asked the keeper who hand-raised the otter pups to rate Cyrene and Awe on these personality dimensions. So as you can see there, they were both rated highly in agreeableness, but while Awe was emotionally stable, Cyrene was rated higher in neuroticism, marked by fearfulness and emotional reactivity. Awe was rated more open to experience, and he was more curious and exploratory, as well as slightly more dominant and extroverted. If this assessment of their personality by proxy is accurate, then it's possible these traits allowed Awe to cope with early maternal separation better than Cyrene was able to cope. And so in response, she developed this paw-sucking as a coping behavior. It may also be that paw-sucking began as a stand-in for a natural suckling behavior since the otters had to be bottle-fed, and now it's become a habit. So while the paw-sucking may have developed under a different situation 16 years ago, and Cyrene is far past suckling age, the paw-sucking behavior is still increasing currently, and so it still requires continued monitoring to determine if the stereotypy signals an inability to cope with something in her current environment. It's possible paw-sucking has just become a habit, but if Cyrene's paw-sucking is a coping mechanism and we can narrow down possible triggers, we might be able to improve her welfare by considering her personal preferences. While the Cyrene saga continues, this case study provides a good opportunity to reinforce the idea that welfare assessments should, whenever possible, be conducted on the individual level in addition to the group level. The study also underlines that animal care specialists and welfare researchers should consider individual personalities and temperaments. While we cannot speak for the animals, keeper-rated personality scores could help bring us closer to understanding individuals. Researchers could continue to develop personality assessments for non-human animals, and eventually, perhaps we can narrow down specific personality traits that are early predictors of stereotypy development and give those individuals additional attention and support. So thank you for listening to my talk. That's my email address if you're interested in discussing anything else a little more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominique. Don't forget, everyone, that you can place your questions in the Padlet. The link is there in the chat box, and we'll go to over to those at the end and get them answered by each of our speakers. And also, you can type them in the chat box in between if you want, or while we're doing the Q&A session, you can also type them in the chat. Now we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is a master's degree student at Canisius College here in the U.S. Alisa works in the animal sheltering field and prioritizes keeping other than human animals in their current homes and communities. I do want to give you another content warning for this presentation. I will be discussing weight-based discrimination and the consequences of weight-based discrimination, such as eating disorders, anxiety, depression, and stress. So with that, I will turn it over to Alisa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be closing out such a fantastic series of talks. My name is Alisa Rubinstein, and I'm a master's student in Anthrozoology at Canisius University now. I learned this the other day that we're at university. And so, yeah, today I'll be talking a little bit about how a One Health framework can be used to dismantle some of the misconceptions about the obesity epidemic in human and veterinary medicine. There we go. So before beginning, just want to rehash a quick content warning. Because of the nature of this topic, fatphobia and weight-based discrimination are going to come up, which I know is a topic that can stir up all kinds of emotions, and I very much appreciate everyone's engagement with this content. But please do take care and feel free to step away at any point. I also want to make a quick note regarding the language that we'll be using. The terms overweight and obese are categories most commonly used in the dominant Western medical system to describe fat healthcare seekers. And because this is the system that we'll be talking about, these terms are going to come up, but I do want to make it clear that they are far from the most ideal way to describe people's bodies. Many fat liberation activists encourage the use of the word fat as a neutral descriptor, like thin or tall, so that's generally the word that I'll be defaulting to. Additionally, I do want to acknowledge that we often use the terms doctors and veterinarians as shorthand for the influence of the dominant medical system. Caregiving professions have extremely high rates of burnout, so I want to be clear that this shorthand is meant to recognize that individual medical professionals often hold power and privilege over their patients, and like all other people, they hold biases, and even well-meaning intent can have a very real and dangerous impact on healthcare seekers. So with that all being said, unpacking our assumptions about weight and health just in humans can be its own talk. So I first want to take a few minutes to share some key information and make sure that we're all on the same page. Although we're often taught to attribute one's weight to their individual lifestyle choices, research shows us that weight is actually determined by a complex set of factors, many outside of one's control. These include genetics, epigenetics, nutrition, environmental factors, body shape and build, etc. In fact, most attempts to lose weight are unsuccessful, as one's body will often compensate to maintain its current weight. Furthermore, the links between weight and overall health are tenuous at best, and research has found that additional fat can be protective in some cases. So fat isn't always unhealthy, and thin isn't always healthy. Because humans come in a variety of shapes and sizes, cardiovascular measures like heart disease and blood pressure are much more directly related to overall health, and the two might not change with weight the way we would expect. So for example, someone who starts exercising could maintain or gain weight while improving their cardiovascular measures and overall health status. So all this to say, this issue is very complicated, and there's still a lot we need to learn before conclusively making claims about the relationships between weight and health. So this then begs the question, if we have limited control over our weight at best, and if the amount of fat on our bodies might not even cause major health risks, where is the fixation on weight coming from in the medical system? Well, science and healthcare don't exist in a vacuum, and there are lots of ways in which culture and politics have affected how fat healthcare seekers are treated within and outside of the doctor's office. A huge piece of this is acknowledging that there's a track record of major pharmaceutical companies and weight loss companies, as well as researchers who run weight loss clinics, funding research and policy on a national and international scale to broaden the definition of obesity, as well as fuel fatphobic rhetoric about the so-called obesity epidemic, which stigmatizes fat bodies and frames them as unhealthy and undesirable. Naturally, the more people believe this, the more they will purchase these products and services with the goal of becoming thinner. Doctors are people too, of course, and the dominant narrative affects how doctors perceive fat bodies, and many hold negative views about fat clients. They report believing that fat clients are overindulgent, lazy, and non-compliant, and some even report that they would rather not treat fat clients at all. It's important to note that this data is based on self-reported views and doesn't account for professionals who might not be aware of their implicit biases. And so we see two major results stemming from these beliefs. One is that doctors spend less time with fat clients and order fewer preventative tests. And another is that fat clients report feeling stigmatized by their doctors, as well as delaying doctor's visits when something is wrong out of fear of being shamed about their bodies or having their concerns blamed on their weight. This is especially true for women, people of color, and trans folks who often already risk receiving substandard care. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that intertwined with all of this is the fact that navigating the world as a member of any marginalized group can itself lead to compromised health by way of minority stress. So this includes existing in a constant state of fight or flight, anxiety and depression, and fat folks in general are prone to eating disorders. And so it turns out that how fat folks are treated by the dominant medical system and by society rather than their weight is a major determinant of their health outcomes. And while we've made some progress in recognizing this in human medicine, we definitely still have a lot of work to do. So now that we've kind of laid that groundwork, we're going to bring it back to how this is related to non-human animals. Recently, public health officials have been encouraged to adopt a One Health framework, which highlights the interface between human, non-human, animal, and environmental health. We very commonly see this approach applied to emerging zoonotic diseases, but we also see it applied to topics like the psychological benefits of the human-animal bond and comparative or translational medicine, which is mainly where we'll be focusing on. It turns out that what we've done a really good job of is taking the fatphobic narrative that exists in human healthcare and extending it to our companion animals. The same troubling assumptions and crisis discourse are used to describe the pet obesity epidemic. And this is just a snapshot of articles that I pulled from Google that frame fatness as something to fear, using words like danger and stating that the epidemic is striking pets. The Journal of Comparative Pathology even published several articles in 2017 that encouraged the use of the One Health framework in this way to prevent obesity. And a lot of the language found in these articles contributes to harmful stereotypes about fat people and animals. A recent study by Pearl et al. Was the first to examine anti-fat bias in veterinary medicine. Veterinarians were shown different combinations of the dog caregiver dyad. So you had a fat dog, fat caregiver, thin caregiver, fat dog, thin caregiver, and thin dog, fat caregiver. And then they were given a survey to assess their attitudes towards and perceptions of these combinations. The results of this study are unfortunately what you might expect based on what we've already discussed. Many of the participants connected the weight of the caregiver and ostensibly made assumptions about their health habits and status with that of the dogs. So they gave credit to thin caregivers for keeping their dogs lean, and they blamed fat caregivers for their dogs being quote unquote obese. Participants were also less likely to attribute fat dogs' weight to biological factors if the caregiver also happened to be fat. Participants also rated the caregivers of fat dogs as unlikely to comply with weight loss regimes for their animals, which directly parallels how human doctors assume fat humans are non-compliant. And perhaps most alarmingly, 10% of participants self-reported recommending that their human clients seek weight management treatment from their physician. The authors themselves were very surprised by these findings, since veterinarians aren't authorized to give human medical advice. And even though the intent of these veterinarians is likely well-meaning, the ultimate impact is a breach of dignity, boundaries, and trust between the care provider and the client. So while the study is preliminary, it certainly informs us that the veterinary community isn't immune to the same biases as human medical professionals and all other people. And so as we keep digging further, it continues to be abundantly clear that the same stigmatization and medicalization of human bodies is being applied to veterinary patients. You might be thinking that the slide looks familiar, and that's because this is the same list of responses to common misconceptions about weight and health in humans that we started with. The One Health framework in this particular case has extended these misconceptions to how we think about non-human animals. Since humans are the most heavily researched animal when it comes to determinants of weight, and the research shows us that it's complicated, it's reasonable to infer that this would be the case, at least for other mammals that are relatively closely related to us, like cats and dogs. We've also found that in other animals, just like in humans, maintaining weight loss is very difficult, and some of the literature on non-human animals acknowledges this, but I do think it's very telling that we don't follow that data to its natural conclusion. Is weight loss the most effective recommendation if it's not only usually unsuccessful, but also perpetuates the harmful narrative of the non-compliant patient when it inevitably doesn't work? And of course, with so much literature in humans showing that weight and health aren't as closely linked as we thought, this is another area where it seems ill-advised to jump to conclusions in companion animals. And to add one final point, an additional parallel we see is that pharmaceutical companies and major food conglomerates like Nestle and Mars have financial stakes in producing and marketing prescription and specialty weight loss foods for companion animals. So there are very powerful players that are economically incentivized to promote thinness as desirable and to conflate it with the health of our cats and dogs. So now that I've spent the last 10 minutes highlighting how One Health has played a role in perpetuating a harmful narrative, where do we go from here? How do we dismantle a narrative that's so deeply ingrained in our medical system, as well as society at large? And can we use the ideas of One Health to improve medical care for healthcare seekers of all sizes and species? We can start by looking to Health at Every Size, which is a framework that's emerged to counteract weight bias in medicine. It summarizes a lot of what we've already discussed, and the goal is to create a more compassionate and holistic approach to human healthcare by acknowledging that people can be healthy on a diverse spectrum of shapes and sizes, that dieting isn't only ineffective, but can have dangerous implications to physical and mental health, that a positive and intuitive relationship with food and exercise can be promoted without a focus on weight loss, and that, perhaps most importantly, regardless of one's health status, their weight should never be a barrier to respectful care, diagnostic testing, and treatment. An excellent application of the One Health framework would be to take some of these principles and develop an equivalent approach that can be used in the veterinary setting to dismantle some of these harmful beliefs and improve the services that fat companion animals and their caregivers receive. The Pearl et al. Study is a great starting point that shows us how the attitudes of veterinarians might parallel those of human doctors. And another potential application of One Health would be to further investigate health outcomes for fat companion animals and how these might be driven by veterinarians' biases. Areas for exploration could include what diagnostics, treatment plans, and overall medical outcomes look like for fat versus thin patients, especially when it comes to concerns that might be attributed to or dismissed due to an animal's weight, how much time veterinarians are spending with fat animals versus thin animals, and whether or not fat human clients or those with fat animals feel stigmatized or shamed when interacting with their vet. And could they be delaying treatment or switching vets often because of this? A complicating factor of the Pearl et al. Study is that they demonstrate that both the humans and the animal's weight seem to affect how veterinarians perceive the caregiver animal dyad. So this does have to be considered when we're trying to figure out the answers to these questions. And finally, some scholars have reframed this dual obesity epidemic as a dual moral panic. Although this isn't an extension of One Health per se, it's a note I want to end on, as it's a helpful framing tool to determine where an extension of One Health is useful versus where we might be extending findings that are produced and popularized by social bias and corporate interests. Moral panic is defined as an artificially created panic or scare in which moral entrepreneurs have demonized dangerous groups to serve their own interests. Moral panics have, with isolated exceptions, been initiated by powerful interest groups to manage the bodies and behavior of threatening groups, often the poor and powerless. So despite everything we've talked about, the complexity of the health research and the very real, indisputable, and tangible effects that fat phobia has on fat people, fat bodies, both human and non-human, are demonized and framed as threats to the moral fabric of society. This is ultimately a form of epistemic violence that takes our attention away from more salient determinants of health that we actually have power over, like housing, access to equitable and affordable healthcare, job security, access to clean water, and food sovereignty. And so to conclude, the way in which the current One Health approach pathologizes fat bodies of all species is ultimately harmful to healthcare seekers. A reorientation of the One Health framework would be one that works to dismantle biases, critically examines the literature to identify biased work, acknowledges the complex, dynamic, and systemic determinants of health, and extends a holistic and compassionate approach to health across the species barrier. Evaluating how exactly One Health is applied to comparative medicine is crucial if we're going to move into a direction of more equitable, just, and dignified healthcare for humans and non-humans of all shapes and sizes. And then I have my references. And thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great presentation. We are just going to switch over to some questions then for our three presenters.